Good morning, everyone. Um, I trust that you can hear me. Um, so I want to, this morning, I want to talk about a story. This is a story about two friends, and one of these friends is very well off, a business person with a very successful business. The other friend is not so well off, is poor. And one time, the poor friend is visiting with his wealthy friend and has way too much to eat and drink, because he's just not used to this much, having access to this kind of good food and good wine. And he has too much to eat and drink, and he falls asleep at his friend's house. And uh, the wealthy friend has to leave early the next morning to go on a business trip, go travel to another country, go make some more money. Uh, and But before he leaves, he takes a priceless jewel, which of course, as a wealthy person, he has these priceless jewels laying around, I guess, um, and he sews it uh, into the lining of his poor friend's robe. Then he leaves, and then the the poor friend wakes up. His friend had told him that he was going to have to leave early the next morning, so he knew he, he wasn't surprised that his friend was gone. And so he leaves, and um, perhaps because of his visit with his wealthy friend, um, he knew that his friend was going to be traveling, going to another country, as part of his business. And so the poor friend says, maybe I'll do that too. Maybe I'll go travel to somewhere else, and my fortunes will improve. So he became basically uh, when rich people or wealthy people or successful business people travel to other countries to make money, they're just considered successful business people doing their business. When poor people travel to another country trying to make money, they're considered economic refugees. But they're both basically doing the same thing. Um, and so the poor friend was now in a distant land, and it didn't really uh, do any better in this other uh, foreign land. And quite some time later, however, he eventually ran into his old wealthy friend, and only at this point does the wealthy friend now tell, which is, so part of this story doesn't really add up logically, but this is a story that the Buddha told. So who am I to say? Um, who am I to poke holes in the plot? But only at this point does the wealthy friend say, "Oh yeah, just look in the seam of your robe," and the poor friend finds the priceless jewel there. So this is a story that the Buddha tells in the Lotus Sutra, and this plot hole, or this logical uh, flaw in the story. Why didn't the rich friend just leave a note for his poor friend? Hey, buddy, hope this helps a little. Um, But really, I think one of the reasons why the Buddha told this story in this way is because really all teaching is like this. All of the teachings of the Buddha are like uh, a priceless jewel that has been sewn into the lining of our coat or robe while we're asleep. Um, Being asleep is uh, the traditional uh, metaphor for the unenlightened state. The Buddha never used the word enlightened or enlightenment. He used the word awake. Well, of course, he didn't speak English, but in Sanskrit or Pali or Prakrit or whatever it was that the Buddha spoke, uh, he described his own experience as awakening, what we sometimes refer to as enlightenment. And in doing so, he also described the state of not being awakened, being asleep, as that's the unenlightened state. And so, in order for the Buddha's teachings to be of any use, to be of any value, they have to be given to us while we're asleep. Because it is only those of us who are still in that sleeping state who need the Dharma. And even though in this particular story, it's the rich friend and the old poor friend meet up again later on after the jewel has been sewn into the lining of the robe, and it's uh, the rich friend tells his poor friend, "Oh yeah, there it is. Just look in the lining of your robe." But to some extent, I think to a great extent, we have to find that jewel for ourselves. But even then, even finding the jewel for ourselves, we still need a lot of help, a lot of indications. Maybe instead of just coming out and saying that uh, the jewel is hidden in the lining of your robe, the rich friend will just kind of look at the lining of your robe, and then you'll say, "What are you looking at?" So sometimes it's still given in terms of hints, and um, there's some value in finding things for oneself. If you've ever had the experience of teaching, and I'm not talking about teaching the Dharma, teaching, I have some experience teaching chemistry, and there are many concepts in chemistry that are somewhat hard to grasp, even in very basic chemistry. In uh, in order to be able to do the kinds of calculations that are necessary in order to understand chemical reactions and to describe chemical reactions, you have to understand a chemical concept called the mole, MOLE. And don't don't worry if you don't know what a mole is or what it means. Um, it's just a way of counting molecules and atoms. Um, but it can be quite difficult to understand what's going on. Uh, and so what you have to do is you have to keep explaining this concept over and over and over again. And one of the ways that you can tell when a student has finally understood something, whether it's a chemical concept or any other kind of concept, is that sometimes they'll get mad and they'll say, "Why didn't you say that before?" And that's actually a very good sign. When someone has finally seen something, when you see it clearly, um, it, and it was always right there, right in front of you. it was always actually pretty clear, and yeah, it makes sense. Once something that didn't make sense now makes sense, and you can really see it for yourself. Um, yeah, and then if you get angry at the teacher for not having explained it properly in the past, that's actually a good sign. Um, so, so even if teachers, whether it's in chemistry or the Dharma or anything else, even if explanations are provided, uh, you still have to work it out yourself. And so when we're initially drawn to the Dharma, uh, it's like visiting with a new friend uh, who has something that we lack, some understanding. Um, but we're still asleep. And yet, even in that state of being asleep, we can receive this precious jewel of the Dharma. You know, one thing that's another kind of weak weak point in this story from the Lotus Sutra is, you know, what what if he lost the robe, or what if he, you know, what if as a poor person traveling around the world looking for work, um, you know, what if his robe got torn, or um, yeah. So, but that also has, there's a certain point in that as well. Only as long as you keep this robe, which means staying in your practice, um, which means really um, practicing while you're still asleep. Because as long as you don't know that the jewel is there, then you're still essentially asleep. And so not only must teaching be given to us when we're in an unenlightened state, otherwise the teaching would be no value. Otherwise the teaching wouldn't be able to help anybody if it couldn't be received uh, while we're asleep. Practice also has to be possible for people who are unenlightened. Otherwise, what value would practice have? What um, yeah, if only enlightened people could practice, well, then what about the rest of us? What should the rest of us do? Um, so one specific example of in my opinion, of this hidden jewel is something very interesting that Zen Master Sung San did in his teaching. Uh, like the um, like the wealthy friend in the story, Zen Master Sung San was a world traveler. And if you wrote to him, he would come and visit you, which is what Zen Master Degak did. He just wrote a letter to Zen Master Sung San. Well, actually, first, Zen Master Sung San wrote, Zen Master Degak, my teacher, uh, in a sense, our teacher, you know, regardless of your personal um, uh, relationship with him. If you're, you know, this group that's meeting here today is um, exists because of Zen Master Daigak's hard work as a teacher. Um, so Daigak read an article in which Zen Master Sung San said, "Anybody who wants to be my student can just write me a letter," which he did. And then he went and visited Zen Master Sung San and felt a connection. Zen Master Daigak had been practicing Zen for many years, I think well over 10 years at this point, and had met teachers, um, but had never felt this kind of connection before. And as a result of that bond that developed, um, then Zen Master Sung San began coming and visiting Daigak in Kentucky, which is how Furnace Mountain came to be. And the first time that I visited Furnace Mountain, thanks to a friend of mine who had discovered this place, Paul Dubin had discovered this place in Kentucky, told me about it, told others about it. One of the things that most struck me was how much chanting they did. I was used to viewing Zen as just sitting, only sitting. And if anything else that was done was just kind of considered some ceremonial sort of add-on, something just kind of added on. The real practice was the silent sitting meditation. And Zen Master Sung San, one of the really distinctive things about his teaching was the emphasis that he placed on chanting practice. Not only the amount of chanting that he encouraged his students to do, but also his attitude towards it as a not as something that's just added on. And he explicitly, even though he also taught sitting meditation and really more sitting than chanting, in terms of the actual amount of time people spent practicing at a retreat, for example. Nevertheless, he communicated to people that, in his view, chanting was not a lesser practice, and it wasn't just something that was kind of in addition to sitting. It was a practice, a valuable practice in and of itself. And this was essentially a precious jewel that he sewed into the hem of our robes while we were asleep. And he never explained what we were chanting. He gave some, he worked on some translations that are pretty loose translations. But in Korea, which is where he was from, when you learn these chants, part of the training of learning these chants, whether you are a monastic living in a monastery or a temple, or a lay person practicing on your own at home, you are expected to learn the meaning of the chants. In fact, a great Korean teacher, Chinul, who, if you know anything about Korean Buddhism, then you know the name Chinul. But he said, and he wrote a little essay once on advice for beginners. And he said, don't just make the sounds. understand the meaning. But he also said, but at the same time, you should learn to make the sounds correctly and uh, try to chant in harmony with others. And so if you look into, um, yeah, but like I said, that's an example. All teaching is like this. Um, and some very often in the Zen school, there's very little um, emphasis placed upon explaining things. Just sit, just do it. Zen Master Sung San actually taught, when sitting, follow the moktak. Or no, got it wrong. So the chukpi is this wooden instrument um, used in traditional Korean Buddhist to just make a wooden sound. And that's used to time the sitting meditation periods. And the moktak is another wooden instrument used to keep the rhythm during chanting. And so one of Zen Master Sung San's explanations for how to practice was uh, when sitting, follow the chukpi. When chanting, follow the moktak. Only that. But that is yet another um, precious jewel sewed into the lining of our robe that we have to eventually find or have it pointed out to us. When we first come to practice, we are attracted out of our poverty, out of our spiritual poverty, to a place where there is spiritual treasure. And yet we remain asleep and poor. But just by having been drawn to the Dharma, we already have the priceless jewel sewn into the lining of our robe. As long as we keep that robe, and which it can be kind of a challenge. Um, it's one thing to say that the teaching has to be somehow accessible to and available to people who are unenlightened, uh, and the practice has to be something that can be done by people that are unenlightened. But along the way, there has to be some encouragement. There has to be something that keeps us coming back. And I believe that's, I think that's true for everyone who engages in a Dharma practice, that there is benefit, that there is, real benefit to us, real world, tangible benefit, um, encouragement to keep coming back. Anyway, all of teaching is a priceless jewel that's sewn into the lining of our robe while we're asleep. And even as we remain asleep and poor, we have that jewel. Um, yeah. So thank you for listening.